can you share a time when you used creativity in your teaching?
I've used some really basic methods. I stomp on the box.
I would wear my toga.
When we were learning about the Vietnam War, we made the placards.
Lots of songs and poetry.
I went into the class with no context and I told the students, you're going to listen to this and I need you to write down what's being told.
Find approaches that work for the group you're teaching.
It's the story of a man named Cato who was being such a big pain in the butt. Like, I've got students in the HSC that have written down the lyrics of the song to help them remember stuff for their 25-mark essay.
Hi, and welcome to Hey History Teacher, a series of evidence-backed tips and advice to help you teach history at primary or high school. You'll hear from history teachers across Australia, experts and university educators. We're getting creative in this episode. In fact, the teachers we talked with had so many ways to bring history alive, we made it into 2 episodes. Creative history teaching and really creative history teaching. In this episode, we ask, what's the evidence for using creativity in the classroom? What do students say? And how can you start small and simple and then use activities that need a bit more planning? I'm your host, Anna Clark, a professor of history at the University of Technology, Sydney, and someone who's passionate about history and history education. We've teamed up with the History Teachers Association of New South Wales to make this professional development resource for you. There are 8 episodes, around 30 minutes each, with free tip sheets and links for every episode on our website, heyhistory.net. Every educator we talked with, and we talked with 12 teachers, principals and lecturers around Australia, had examples of creative history teaching they'd used. For some, like Natalie Fong, it was the reason they became a history teacher in the first place.
My name is Natalie Fong. I am the Head of Humanities at City Point Christian College. I am a history and an English teacher. We were studying the French Revolution and we held the trial of Marie Antoinette. And this was over a few lessons and we spent quite a lot of time preparing this, doing research to find the evidence whether Marie Antoinette should be found guilty of their involvement of various things which might have led to the French people becoming, as we say, angry and rising up. So the student who played Marie Antoinette really drew on her drama skills and Marie Antoinette was a real sort of character and we all played some characters in this trial, whether as lawyers, etc. So some of those things that stick in my mind of how you can teach history in a creative way. And all of this would lead much later for me to becoming a history and an English teacher.
And for Chad Carey, it was getting wrapped in toilet paper in grade 7.
I am Chad Carey and I am a history teacher from Casula High School in Sydney, Southwest. I've been teaching here for 13 years. This is my second home. I used to come here as a student myself, so I don't really know too much different. I had a lot of lessons in Year 7 that I don't remember, but it was that one lesson. We went out of the classroom and we were learning about mummification for ancient Egypt. We were told about the bandaging process. So I remember going on the back oval with toilet paper and that special objects were placed inside. So we were given a whole bunch of different little crafty objects and we had to take a photo out in the back. I don't remember it taking very long. I just remember the photos at the end of it and everyone laughing and having a good time. I reflected on that as a teacher, thinking, wow, I still remember that. Why did I remember that? Because it stood out. It was different. It was something out of the ordinary. It was something that engaged me.
Creative teaching introduces surprise and novelty. No wonder Natalie Fong and Chad Carey still remember these history classes. But is there evidence to support learning outcomes too? One recent meta-analysis combining studies with nearly 10,000 students found that creative teaching drives deeper thinking, and that deeper thinking tends to improve learning outcomes. You can find links to those research papers in the show notes for this episode, in your podcast app and on the website heyhistory.net. The English historian David Lowenthal famously said that the past is a foreign country. He meant, of course, that people living in the past weren't necessarily the same as us. Sure, they were people, like we're people, but they lived in a different world. They experienced that world differently, Their emotions and the ways they engaged and related to each other were different, so we can't assume that they're exactly like us. Part of history's attraction is that difference, the leap of imagination required to enter into those worlds. That makes history fascinating, and it's a great opportunity to bring in creativity to do some of that time travel, to spark curiosity, and to build on the knowledge you've been generating in class to bring it to life. Before you introduce creative ways of teaching into your history class, teachers had 2 pieces of advice. Here's David Boone, who's had a 36-year career in education. He's taught from all of primary to year 10 and has held a number of curriculum and professional learning roles.
You've got to look at your class. So you've got to find approaches that work for the group you're teaching, not just think that it's going to work for all of them.
I'm sure it's not surprising to you listening that Know Your Students is a tip that comes up in every episode in this series, and it helps you decide, will this activity work for my kids, or could I try something else? And secondly, you're teaching from the curriculum, so how can you balance that with creative teaching, even creative assessment, especially in the senior years? Chad Carey has a secret formula. He pulls back the curtains on the history class schedule. He shows them the scope and sequence. Scope and sequence? Are you kidding me? I can hear you saying, that document would send my students to sleep. Well, not this scope and sequence. This one has some extra colour and humour thrown in.
So this is a scope and sequence that I put together at the start of a topic. There's not a lot to it. It's just a grid with our weeks and the days of the week. In my white squares, those are your more traditional lessons where we'll be explaining key concepts, going through PowerPoints, perhaps watching little videos, that sort of stuff. So the black lessons are very dark days because I don't teach ancient history on those days. So they're horrible days. And then I've got the syllabus area written down there. And then there are certain colours throughout that symbolise different days to make sure they don't miss, days to look forward to. So we've got a purple day, which will be their escape room. I've got some sprinkling of the creative and innovative teaching and learning ideas. So you can't do it every lesson, but one of the things that gives me the motivation to continue to do it is by sharing the scope and sequence with the students. Dave Burgess calls it in Teach Like a Pirate, preheating the grill before you get your content to sizzle.
Teach Like a Pirate by David Burgess is a book about teaching for student engagement. There's a link in the episode notes on our website.
So I'll let them know ahead of time that they've got these opportunities that are coming up, and it's extra motivation. We need to get through certain course concepts and content before they're able to engage with the experience days. So again, it's about sprinkling the innovation and creativity throughout the term.
Basically showing students their learning plan with the curriculum on it and how it's going to be taught. The ordinary, yes, it's a PowerPoint lesson, the assessment lessons they mustn't miss, and the fun, creative lessons at school or on excursions to get students and you through a long term. Chad generously agreed to share an example colour-coded scope and sequence with us. You can download it, along with tip sheets for this episode and all the others, by signing up on our website. And there's evidence for sharing the syllabus and teaching plans with students ahead of time and giving them creative activities to look forward to. Academic research shows that when students understand the big picture expectations and criteria across a whole program, they can regulate their learning and perform better. So let's get to the ideas that you can hopefully apply to any of your history content areas. The first activity is small, but it has big impact, literally.
My name's Paul Foley, and I'd probably regard myself as early career teacher. I've only been teaching 40 years, and that means I'm keen on learning. I think you have to be a lifelong learner as a history teacher. And I've taught in country Victoria for 20 years, and now I'm teaching in metropolitan Adelaide. I've used some really basic methods. For example, explaining how Germany was treated at the end of World War I via the Treaty of Versailles. It's easy, and I always do this safely. I just get an old A4 cardboard box that once had photocopy paper in it. Write in big letters on the outside, post-World War I Germany, and then as I read out the reparations, or I get a student to read it out, I stomp on the box, and then stomp it again, and then kick the box. And some of the students go, I've never forgotten the box. I've never forgotten. And you go, well, this is kinesthetic learning and this is as good as it gets, but it does make an impression. So, that's pretty basic creativity 101, but there are so many ways you can do it.
Kathy Barron has an example of reenacting history that especially suits active students.
I've been a history teacher for about 34 years, thus the wrinkles and the grey hair, but the big smile on the face. I'm involved with the History Teachers Association of Australia. I'm currently the national president. I currently work as a principal of my school. I used to have a group of Year 9 boys who were sort of a little bit disengaged with history. So one day I went, right, get your backpacks, and we filled them up with books. And we were doing World War I, so we went out to the Oval and they made them run around the Oval and do jumping jacks and all these kind of things, and said, this is what soldiers in World War I with their knapsacks. And the kids loved it, and it got them engaged in history. So I guess where I use creativity in my teaching is to try and engage the kids with the content, but also it's really important to have that balance so they're learning in what they're doing and they're being engaged, but they are also looking at how they can apply that.
That's an example of a really easy way to reenact the past. We've got other ideas that involve a bit more planning coming up. What are other easy ways to bring creativity to your teaching? Chad Carey lets his walls do the talking.
As soon as you walk into the classroom, you're punched in the face with history. I think one of my students delicately put it, it's like a history textbook threw up in here, and I like that way of describing it. There seems to be, a lot going on, a lot I can refer to, but on the back wall comes in very handy. We've got the ancient history timeline in the middle. We've got a medieval timeline from top to bottom. We've got the modern history timeline, so I find myself referring to that quite often. So using the walls that teach.
You'll also find figurines and other props on his classroom shelves.
I like to utilise lots of props, lots of visuals, because I know that there are a lot of students that are visual learners. So I'll just show you a friend of mine. All right, so this is Julius Caesar. I've got a costume for Anubis, one of my favourite Egyptian gods.
And this next one, it's a classic.
My guest speakers. So I've got some of the key historians. I've laminated their heads and put them on rulers. They are always very well received.
Chad has printed A4-sized heads of historians, laminated them and attached them to paddle pop sticks. Chad, you can expect my laminated head in the post any day. And you can see Chad Carey, his classroom walls, figurines and those other laminated historians' heads on our website. The last example in this first half of easy ways to get creative in history teaching is dress-ups. Here's Natalie Fong.
I like to dress up in costumes that relate to what we're learning about. For example, Year 8 history, where we learning about medieval history, but we start off looking at the transition from the ancient world to the medieval world. Ancient Rome, for example, I would wear my toga and we would talk about the benefits and disadvantages of wearing a toga. So the next week we might transition into the medieval period, and then I would come dressed in my medieval dress, which is fake purple velvet with the big sleeves. And again, we talk about there's some restriction of movement if you're a woman. And I always make the joke that the costume, because I try to do the dishes in this costume, it's really difficult to keep the sleeves from getting wet. And what does that tell us? It tells us that the sort of women that wore these kinds of dresses, they would not have been doing their own washing up, concluded. So that tells you something about the class system. When we're looking at the 1920s and the Great Depression, I come dressed in my flapper outfit, and we would talk about how these young people were in a way rebelling against what they had just experienced, which was World War I, and also the rise of the jazz age music as an important cultural phenomenon. And we also look at not just flappers, but they're also the male equivalent of the flappers, the sheiks, and how these things that are happening in fashion history can reflect what was happening in society.
We've reached the halfway point of this episode. If you need to have a break or jump online to History Costume Warehouse, go for it. Here are some tips from the first half of the episode.
Find approaches that work for the group you're teaching.
So this is a scope and sequence that I put together at the start of a topic.
I stomp on the box. That's pretty basic creativity, 101, but there are so many ways you can do it.
So using the walls that teach.
So we made them run around the oval. I said, this is what soldiers in World War I with their knapsacks. And the kids loved it, and it got them engaged in history.
Welcome back if you had a break. From ideas that don't need much planning or materials, we're now sharing activities that need a little bit more time, but are still pretty easy. First up is Kathy Barron, sharing 2 different ways to step into the past.
When we were learning about the Vietnam War, we looked at the social history around the Vietnam War. We made the placards and then we went out the front of the school, and this was a country town, Northam in Western Australia, and we went outside the front of the school dressed up and we protested against the Vietnam War out the front of the school, much to the interest of community passing by. Then my principal at the time was an ex-history teacher, so she was very keen to sort of play along with it, and she came out and she had birthdays. So there were kids' birthdays and we did a ballot draw.
Wow, doing a ballot draw of which students will get sent off to war. I'm sure those students really remembered that exercise. You can also get creative with other difficult histories, as Kathy Barron explains.
I wanted to do an assignment where the kids were looking at how the Nazis were able to gain power. So I got them to create political parties of their own that were quite different, and they had to use some of the strategies that the Nazis had used. And the kids were so creative and had so much fun. And I had this classroom that was in the corner, and this group got up and they said, "You are now all surrounded." And they had made silhouettes of people to put along the window.
If you'd like advice and tips on teaching difficult histories, check out our episode on that topic too. And a third example of how to bring a difficult history to life, this one's from Christine Abadir.
Hello, my name is Christine Abadir. I'm the current head of history at Tara Anglican School for Girls, which is an ELC to Year 12 school in North Parramatta in Sydney. I've been teaching for 11 years, most of which has been history teaching. So for me, the first activity that comes to mind when I think of this is just such a simple one to introduce teaching the White Australia policy, which is kind of social policies that we teach in Year 9 history in New South Wales. When the policy was implemented, they also included a dictation test, and it could be given in any European language. And so I got a friend of mine to record one of those extracts for me in Dutch. And then I went into the class with no context and I told the students, you're going to listen to this and I need you to write down what's being told. And at first they're very confused. They're trying to determine what language is it. They're trying to figure it out. I said, okay, let's mark it. Let's see how you went. And then we try it again, and then they get very invested and they actually want to actually get it right, and they really struggle. It's like a 5 or 10 minute exercise, but then it's this segue into a discussion on what was the Immigration Restriction Act, how was it implemented, once again, the factors of the dictation test and what did that actually mean, and then leading that into a discussion around this being one of the first policies that the Australian government actually implemented after Federation. So it's something so small, and I think when it comes to this idea of using creativity, it doesn't need to be really big, really drawn out, weeks-long projects that you spend hours and hours on. It can actually be really creative by just doing something really small to start your lesson. So that for me is always the one that I default to, and I've now sent the file to a couple of other teachers who use it in their classrooms, and it's just something that leads the kids into a bit of discussion. You know, they find it amusing initially, but then they're actually really invested in why is this relevant to them.
As you'll hear in our episode Connect with Country Through School and Syllabus, connecting with members of your local First Nations communities is recommended. But if this can't happen, think creatively to bring First Nations voices into the classroom. Here's Megan Tucker.
My name is Megan Tucker. I teach at Kadina Memorial School on the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia. I live and work on the traditional lands of the Narungga people. I generally teach Year 10 through to Year 12 history and SACE. I'm also a faculty leader and I work with the History Teachers Association of South Australia and the History Teachers Association of Australia. I work in a very white community, regional farming community. So I've had to adjust the way that I'm doing that. I use lots of songs and poetry, and I use little video clips of Indigenous people who've spoken about being a member of the stolen generation or whatever it is, and use those as a source analysis rather than me try to tell the story.
David Boone used another kind of creative source, fiction, to prime his students for what was coming next.
Tom Appleby is a book by Jackie French, and it's based loosely on a convict called John Hudson, who was a child convict on the First Fleet. But she also wrote a novel called Ngambri, children's novel called Ngambri, which is about the contact with First Nations Australians as well. I taught about the First Fleet in third term, but in first term I read Tom Appleby, and in second term I read Ngambri as the class novel. So they had this prior knowledge from a novel, but then we explored, when we actually look at it, Tom Appleby and John Hudson, we got John Hudson's trial records and we said, what's in the novel, what's the same, what's different in what's in his actual trial records. We also then looked at non-fiction books about the First Fleet. So we had a map of the first settlement, but it mentioned characters who are the real people who are characters in those novels, and it had where they were on the map. And so having that background of the fiction, they related it to these fictional characters and saying, oh, well, there's the Reverend, there's the, where the convicts were, Rushcutters Bay's mentioned. And so seeing those different things on a map then made it really come to life.
The next few tips are about creativity outside the classroom. Natalie Fong on bringing difficult histories to life through first-person experiences.
We've been studying the involvement of Australia in the Vietnam War as preparation for the Year 12 Modern History external exam. And as our last lesson, we went to a local Vietnamese restaurant, which is run by a family who came out to Australia in the aftermath of the war. And they were able to share their experiences of what was life like in Vietnam during the war. They did meet Australian soldiers because they were living near the base in Vung Tau, and also sharing about their treacherous journey from Vietnam to Australia, of having to gather together all the funds that you have. They built their own boat, which was 7 meters long, that held 22 of their friends and family on a journey which turned out to be 5 days with only water and the clothing on their backs. They didn't take anything because they didn't have room. And these are people's real lived experiences. And it brings it alive for the students because they can see the emotional impact.
And David Boone got inspired by historical maps of the local area and then a National Trust poster of heritage buildings.
The school had been built near a former swamp, and the old directories actually had the swamp shown in them. I started to think, I can use this with kids, and I can get them to find out what was the past like and how has it changed over time by using those sorts of sources with them. These are preps 1s and 2s. These are kids that are 5 years old to 8 years of age, and they were actually using them and getting involved. I then had a prac student who came in, whose partner was an architect, and she decided she was going to do a thing on the history of houses. And I'm thinking, a bit deep for this age group. But anyway, we went off and we found a really good poster from the National Trust, and which we discovered had just really simple diagrams or pictures of the different architectural styles. A green background with cream outline of the buildings. What I discovered was kids were really good at picking out the features in the houses, much better than most adults. So they could look at the gables and they could look at the chimneys and they could look at the doors and the shape of the windows, and they would see the properties of a house, the physical properties of a house that most adults, I've never been able to teach adults about it, but this was this was 5-year-old kids. They didn't have that idea of the scale of time necessarily, but we could sequence the order of time. So we could say this was first, this was second, this was third, this was fourth. We did a timeline with the different houses and created that. We then went out into the local area and looked for different houses, and eventually went on a walk around Battery Point, which has got just about every architectural style from the 19th century. And we had these 5-year-olds going around Battery Point going, oh, look, there's a primitive Georgian. Oh, look, there's a Gothic revival. And we had tourists stopping and looking at these kids.
And I bet the tourists were taking notes too. Our last tip for creative teaching for this episode is musical, and it's from Chad Carey again.
One thing that stands out, so Year 12, Ancient History, we do full of the Roman Republic, and the content's very dense, and a lot of the things are quite challenging, difficult to comprehend, and you're trying to differentiate, so catering for high band aspiring students, and for me, there's the whole scale in my classroom, sometimes 20, 24 students, and you're catering for all needs. The power of music is actually a big one, and out of almost nowhere, I must have heard the jingle from the opening of the Brady Bunch.
Here's the story of a lovely lady who was
and I must have been studying up on the Roman Republic at the same time, and just out of nowhere I just started going, maybe I could turn this into a bit of a song. Maybe I could turn the content into a bit of a song. It's one of the best things I do, and I just annoy the students with it. So as soon as they come into class, it's now on YouTube, and I've got a little video that goes with it. And by the end of it, everyone can sing it in unison. It's the story of a man named Cato, who was being such a big pain in the butt. He was blocking legislation with the Optimates, which made the triumvirs sad. And then I'll just go around with a microphone, a fake microphone prop, and get the whole class involved. So they're either cringing, like trying to hide, but at the end of it, like I've got students in the HSC that have written down the lyrics of the song to help them remember stuff for their 25-mark essay. I never really thought it would evolve into that. And then I had a student who really loved to contribute to stuff like that and ended up taking the song, taking the audio and creating her own music video to it.
And that's how you become an awesome history teacher. Okay, here are those expert tips on creative history teaching from the second half of the show.
So there were kids' birthdays and we did a Vietnam War ballot draw.
And then I went into the class with no context and I told the students, you're going to listen to this and I need you to write down what's being told. It can actually be really creative by just doing something really small to start your lesson.
I use lots of songs and poetry, and I use little video clips as a source analysis rather than me try to tell the story.
What I discovered was kids were really good at picking out the features in the houses, much better than most adults.
The power of music is actually a big one.
I'm Anna Clark, and you've been listening to Hey History Teacher. In the next episode, you can keep feeling inspired because we've got more creative ideas, and there are 6 other episodes for you in this series, from difficult histories to what makes great history teaching, advice for teachers new to history, teaching the Australian Wars, connecting to country and school and syllabus, and teaching history in all its complexity. A huge thanks to all the teachers we spoke to for this series.
Kathy Barron,
Chad Carey,
Paul Foley,
Christine Aberdeen,
Megan Tucker,
Natalie Fong,
and David Byrne.
I also have the same name as a very famous Australian cricketer.
Get a tip sheet summary of this episode on our website, heyhistory.net, and follow Hey History in your podcast app. This episode and the whole professional development series is funded by the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. Special thanks to Jonathan Dallimore. Hey History Teacher is produced by Jane Curtis at UTS Impact Studios. The executive producer of this series is Anna Clark. This podcast was made on Gadigal country in Sydney, Australia. Thanks for listening.